Today on the Roundtable Perspective, my co-host, Dr. Lee Artz, joins me in examining media in Latin America. Dr. Artz is a scholar of media and political communication in Latin America, and he recently returned from Cuba, where he presented a paper on capitalism and radio. Lee, as you may know, has a lot of opinions on this subject, and he is going to be very generous in sharing them with us on our next show. Join me. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Lee Artz, to discuss commercial and public media in Latin America. Dr. Artz has made a career out of studying this. He had a dissertation on the Nicaraguan Revolution. He has book chapters and journal articles on commercial and public media in Venezuela. He has a book that came out in paperback edition last month, Public Radio in Latin America. And he recently returned from Cuba, where he was at a conference on global capitalism in Latin America, I believe, right?
Yes.
And he met with the head of public radio, I think, the head of the
Agencia Noticias Cubana, which is ACN, it's the Associated Press of Cuba.
So, Lee, just as a starter here, how is generally media different in Latin America than how we see it in America? What would you say to kind of give people an orientation on where this goes?
Well, first I want to say it's strange being on this side. I didn't know I had to go all the way to Havana to get to be a guest on the show that I host. So thanks for that opportunity.
Nice to have you as a guest, yes.
I think before we talk about Latin American media as a whole, each country there's a different structure and different forms of media. All of the countries, with the exception of Cuba, will have commercial media, and they are pretty much dominated by that commercial media. And then different countries, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, has a more robust public media. Mm-hmm. And then some of those countries also have a very active and energetic community media network, both radio and television.
Right. So one of the striking differences then is that in some countries at least, you have a much more developed community media operation.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, we have community media in the United States with the early 2000s when the FCC began licensing what they call low-power FM stations with 100 watts. I think there's 2,500 stations in the country, but they can only cover about a 7-mile radius and very low wattage. Community media radio, for instance, in Venezuela, there are 500 stations. Radio Primero Negro, Radio 23 Enero, both of those are multiple thousands of watts of broadcast, so they can reach 6 million people every day. A whole different definition of community radio, which we have no experience with in this country. And it's one of the markers of, in particular, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, not all of the other countries to that degree.
So describe it a little bit for us, just so people get a sense of what.
Well, one of the things that happened in one of the arguments in the book, The Pink Tide, that you mentioned that just came out, the argument is that you can judge the level of democracy in any society by the amount of access that the public has to make their own media. Not just like we've got a wealth of information. We can watch 200 television stations. You can't find an empty spot on the dial. But we're just spectators or we're listeners.
Right.
The difference is when public media or community media, Uruguay, Ecuador, some other countries, it means that you can have your own radio station in your neighborhood or in your constituency. Like in Venezuela, miners have their own Mineros Radios, which is a radio station for miners, or Afro TV in the west coast of Venezuela, where the African community has its own television station.
And that's funded by the state?
Well, the resources are available. They use the funds from oil sales rather than going to private corporations. That money goes into a social fund, and it's used for many things: education, healthcare, subsidizing basic foodstuffs, and a very small part of that is to provide for the infrastructure for the media. But like anything else, once we have the cameras here on radio, on the Roundtable, the cameras, once they're paid for, they're paid for. And just like students are doing it for a class project or as a learning experience, community radio or television in Venezuela, no one's getting paid. It's because they want to be able to tell their stories, they want to be able to play their music, they want to be able to have a dialogue with people in their community about things. So that's a totally different concept. It really does become the right to communicate. Not just the right to hear, but the right to communicate. And it changes, I think it changes the human experience.
So I'm a shop owner in Venezuela and I want to broadcast something. What do I do?
Well, in most cases, the radio stations are based upon a geographical region. So if you were a small shopkeeper in one part of Caracas and there was a radio station in that community, usually community councils run the make decisions like town councils for that community, and you would go like any other citizen of that neighborhood. In most cases, they have monthly, sometimes more often, meetings. You would say, I'd like to do a show on my favorite musician. They would find out that you can actually run the equipment. You would be scheduled for a time that's available out of the 168 hours, and you would produce your show.
So I'm producing it, though. I've got to go into the studio and run everything.
Yes, you or a team like Katia TV, which has been around long before the election of Chavez and the Socialist Party of Venezuela. They were around a long time. They have teams, they're called ESPEs. So, teams of people, 5 or 6 people would get together and say, we want to do a television program about the Little League team in our neighborhood. And they would decide who's going to be the camera owner, who's going to be the interviewer, how long it's going to be, and they produce it.
Why would anybody want to watch that when they could be watching Stranger Things or zombies, something like that?
Well, part of the issue is the kind of world in which we're raised in. I mean, why would anybody want to eat a full-course vegetarian meal of hummus when they could go to McDonald's and get chicken nuggets? If you're raised and your palate is raised on that kind of communication or that kind of nutrition, that's what you tend to want. And certainly in Venezuela, 60 to 65% of the media is still commercial media, like Venevisión with telenovelas and beauty pageants and baseball games, and people, yes, absolutely, they watch that. But the community station is something like, instead of going to the corner bar and to share a drink and get to know things, you can actually listen to the radio station about what your neighbors are thinking and have political debates. And to the extent that you want those, you will listen to and participate in that production.
Yeah, so I mean, historically, I see the need for this. The earliest democracies in Greece, say in Athens, maybe a few thousand people were voters. If you wanted to make an argument for some legislation, you could literally give speeches around town, basically, and have your way. We get to the modern mass democracies, and we've got 300 million people, and so we're dependent on mass media in order to know what's going on so we can function as citizens, but it lets us receive information, but it doesn't let us send it back, right? We really can't engage in two-way communication.
We receive very filtered information, yes.
Yeah, so these countries that are allowing for these free access options for their citizens are compensating for that, and I get that. But now that we have social media, now that it's possible to start a blog or to leave comments at the newspaper's blog, things like that, is there still a need for this? How's it reacting to that? Where's it going?
Well, first of all, I'd say we'd have to unpack the argument that social media has improved democratic communication. It's very narrow.
It's created more options.
Well, options, yes, but it's like the option that I could go in a closet and I could talk all I want and I have free speech. But free speech doesn't amount to me just mouthing off. Free speech also requires that I have an opportunity to speak to people that are going to make decisions. Social media allows for a lot of that, but the primary driver of Facebook or Google or YouTube or anything else is the number of hits so they can sell it to advertisers. So if you aren't doing what is commercially driven, you're not going to get a founding. The biggest one I know of is Psy, where he did the Gangman, right? The dance, got 1 million and some hits, right?
Yeah.
Well, Chicago Tribune has 350,000 readers every day of the week, 365 days of the year. I don't care if you do a blog and you get 1 million hits. You are not competing with ABC or CNN because you don't have the distribution capability. The difference is in many of these countries, including in Argentina until their last election, they have changed their constitutions so that from now on, the spectrum licensing will be 1/3 set aside for commercial, 1/3 set aside for public, and 1/3 set aside for community media. In a country like Bolivia, that includes special broadcasting rights for the indigenous population that can't understand the language of the major TVs anyway. So they really benefit from having access to producing their own radio and television, yes. It's a whole different mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when cable TV started, I remember I was in junior college, and this was in the very early 70s, and they recruited some of us from the college to actually do broadcasts on cable because they didn't have anything to air, and my campus movie review column ended up being a TV show for a year. And you know, as you're describing this, it's sort of reminding me of what the early cable was like, because they were actually, you know, desperate enough for material that they were encouraging people from the community to come on and do shows like that, although I didn't have to produce it. But so you were just in Cuba.
I was just in Havana for 6 days. I was at a conference. It was an international conference with people from around the world, Australia, Europe, a sizable number of Cuban participants. It was a conference called Global Capitalism in Latin America, and it included sociologists. I was one of the few media studies people there, but it was to assess the research that people have done as what is the consequence of the expanding global trade and global production in a new order, and what is its effect on Latin American culture. So yes, it was a very exciting conference. I presented this argument that we can measure democracy by the amount of access that the public has to producing their own media, which was embedded within that was a mild critique of the Cuban system, because the Cuban system has very contradictory manifestations of this. And
okay, so let's go there. So just to frame this, if we put this on a spectrum here, and you have a completely commercial media in a particular country, maybe the United States is close to that, maybe not, and then you've got one of these nations that has the 3 divisions, right?
Yes. Many of them they're in the Constitution, yes.
And it may be protected in the Constitution. Where's Cuba on that?
I spent 2 days with Radio Havana, Cuba, the chief correspondent for them in the English language, and another whole day with the senior editor from the ACN, which is their Associated Press. And Radio Havana, Cuba says that the difference is that there's not so much as censorship that you can't say or do this, but people are trained just like in our journalism schools. You're trained with a certain understanding of what makes credible news, what's interesting. Ours tends to be celebrity, crisis, and crime, right? In Cuba, it tends to be what is the average Cuban and what is daily life and how does this reflect it, along with what international affairs will have on this. And the man from his name was Juan Wacamino, who was the editor at Radio Havana, Cuba, says they struggle every day to tell the stories of the average Cuban. So he was telling a story about a bricklayer, and he talked to me about this at length. But what happens is the actual physical access that the average Cuban would have in Venezuela or Bolivia or Ecuador, don't have in this country, but would have in those countries, also does not exist in Cuba. You could be interviewed by Radio Havana or by the television station. They have 5 national stations: sports, culture, education. But my critique is that if you want to know what democracy is, it means I should be able to talk to the population about my ideas. That does not exist there. And the journalists that are there recognize this as a difficulty.
So what we consider public radio, public television, they've got something similar to that. What they don't have, and what we don't have very much of,
is community.
Is community.
Right, and they don't. And I guess you could call some of their stations public service television, like the
Yeah.
educational stations would look a bit like NPR or PBS. But they also have stations that show Venezuelan, Brazilian telenovelas. So if you want to watch sports all day and baseball and soccer, you can do that. So when you're watching the content, it looks very similar. But if your perspective is democracy is about us deciding how to run our lives, that's still quite muted, yes.
Yeah.
There has been an opening. I was in Cuba 15 years ago, and there were several things about my visit this time that were striking. The striking thing this time is the tremendous increase of tourism, because Cuba is an island, and they make sugar and tobacco. You can't build a socialist society on sugar and tobacco. And for a while, they had trade with Eastern Europe. When that went away, they didn't have much left, and the economy had a problem. They're looking to tourism to bring tourism in their dollars. But at the same time, that meant that there was an opening to allow for an increase in the number of small businesses. So there's a large increase in small businesses, everything from pizza parlors to bars and restaurants to taxi drivers to barber shops to English as a second language storefront. So that was a remarkable change from Cuba even 15 years ago. And that means that there's going to be some cultural changes as well. And I think that will affect the question of media, and it certainly already affects communication.
Well, what if you just look at this in terms of free speech, right? If someone wants to start a newspaper in Havana, and they're opposed to the regime, let's say, right, the government. Can they do that? Do they get resistance?
I don't. The only people I know that try to start some separate news event are those people that have direct ties to the people that fled Cuba in the 60s. The ones that are in Miami.
The Miami group,
Yeah, the Miami group. And there's a group of Cuban women, maybe a dozen, that dress up in white, and they have their protest and their... But in terms of the population, the journalists can present their news reports, and within that context, they can provide critiques. The academics certainly publish, like the conference we were at, that I was at. Maybe a third of the people there were Cuban, and they presented critiques of the Cuban government.
Did you sense any constraints at your conference?
No. In fact, the people I were with said they felt more comfortable walking the streets of Havana at night than they did in any country they'd been in the world. I certainly felt more comfortable there. No, there's the difficulty is that there's no culture of this exchange of criticisms.
Right.
And there is criticisms, but it's not organized or orchestrated with a radio show like we might have, where somebody could say it. But at the universities, at the corner market, with people on the street, I mean, we saw there was public displays of art, like an arts and crafts show down El Prado, which is this major street, and people, and there was I remember one photograph in particular. It said El Socialismo. It's a photograph somebody had painted on the wall, and then they have a guy there that's obviously destitute. That's a political commentary. Nobody said you can't have that photo. Nobody said you can't put that up. It's a commentary, right? So, in that sense, it's a free and open society. In the sense that they have elections, this is the beginning of their election cycle. Everywhere there were small posters that says elections are coming. They have 168 municipalities. There's 2,000 to 3,000 candidates for those 168 posts. And anybody can run. The last time around, there was a Presbyterian minister that got elected to one of the local city councils. So it's not like dominated where somebody checks what you are. There's not campaigning. You don't buy campaign ads. You don't stand on the street corner. But the process of deciding who's going to be your mayor or who's going to be the city council, that's open and available.
Well, okay, well, let's go back to Venezuela for a minute. We're looking at the political side of this as well. So tell us about how things shifted in Venezuela when the coup happened.
Well, what happened...
We're talking 2000...
2002. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected. He was not a socialist. He just was elected. He campaigned on supporting Simón Bolívar and using the wealth of our nation for the population. And some of the first...
Which is a socialist
well, yeah, to
agenda,
the extent that FDR is, he nationalized industry,
okay.
right? Yeah, I mean, it's a question of should you have social
I
security.
think there are lots of Republicans who think that FDR was a socialist.
Well,
so
yeah, I'm sure they probably
there.
think Denmark or Sweden or Chile is too, but they have free education as well. So all he was doing was a basic liberal reform that said we should use the wealth of the resources we have, and he used it for education.
And they had this citizen access to media at the time, right?
No.
Oh, they didn't? Okay.
No, it was totally commercial. It was Venezuelan with swimsuit contests and baseball games and telenovelas. Venezuelan still is the major TV station.
Okay.
What he said is communities should be able to decide what they want, and we'll use this social wealth. So they set up local schools, they set up local missions to provide nutrition, and they also began to establish radios and TV stations.
Okay.
And now you have radio and TV stations, and people are beginning to have this conversation like we are, and that irritated largely, not because of the stations per se, but because the money that used to go to private interests, to the very elite, was now going to the general population. And there was a race dynamic. They called him Pardo, which is not a very nice term for somebody that's not European Venezuelan.
Yeah.
And so what happened was they had a coup against the elected government. And that coup, it's termed as the first media coup in history.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get to. So how did the role of the media change after the coup?
Well,
we just have a couple
the
minutes
coup
here.
was organized by the owners of RCTV, which was the biggest station. They had a coup.
Yeah.
They arrested Chavez. They took him to an island. They abolished the Constitution. They disbanded the National Assembly, and they closed down all of the public television stations.
Yeah.
And on the private stations, they started showing cartoons. That was the coup. So you know what's coming when people say they don't like democracy in Venezuela. Well, they don't like Chavez or Maduro. Fortunately, at that time, there were community radio stations in Caracas, and people listened to them.
And they were still operating.
And they operated because the coup leaders did not go to the general population's neighborhoods. They lived in gated communities. Right. And when the community station said, our president has been kidnapped, the entire population of Caracas dropped everything and marched down to Miraflores and said, "Where's Chavez?" Which frightened the heck out of the coup people, and they all scurried away, and Chavez is back within a couple days, and the coup is done. The interesting thing is...
Well, so these radio stations had a big part
without the radio stations, without the independent organization of the community,
so the lesson
there
is
probably would have been a coup.
If you're planning a coup, don't just take over the TV stations. You also have to take over the local.
Well, that was their plan. Yes, that happens everywhere. Look at Erdogan in Turkey, or the Sisi in Cairo. That first thing they always do is they get control of the means of communication, or will show us more telenovelas or music or cartoons as a system of avoiding that conversation. Right. So and since then the law has been changed. They have a 2002, a 2010, a 2014. Each time there has been national discussions, referendums, elections, and they've made the right to communicate more fundamental to Venezuelan citizenship. Civil society now, it's embedded in the Constitution, it's funded so that there are more community radio stations, community TV stations, larger public stations.
Sure.
Our students here, if they were in Caracas, would be on TV Avila, which covers the entire city. It's like a hip-hop station. Everybody's just so cool playing hip-hop music.
Well, don't get their hopes up here, because we're not going to let them.
Hip-hop with a political... hip-hop with a...
opportunity here,
Which, incidentally, if our viewers wanted to, you can go on the internet and you can type in Avila TV, and you can find their broadcasts. You could do B-Base TV, you can find their broadcasts, and you could even compare them with some of the commercial stations. And you would answer this question: why would people watch it? Because Avila is as hip and as contemporary and as professionally done as anything on commercial TV. It just has a different understanding that we're here for humanity, we're not here for the shareholders, which is a very inspirational thing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is something to be said for a lot of money coming in for the production. I mean, if you're shooting, Terminator 5 or whatever we're at right now, It's not something you can put the special effects together in your basement, right?
Well, yeah, there's something to be said, because Disney and Warner Brothers will make a fortune, and then Disney uses it to not let Los Angeles Times come to review their movies because they didn't like what the... If there's a media company that can shut down the LA Times, and we don't understand that that's censorship, and we don't understand that the LA Times, to get permission to do it, will have some fake news about Disney, we're missing what's happening with the media in this country. So I would not suggest that Venezuela or anywhere else is a model, but I'm saying it is a model for the possibilities of the right to communicate.
Okay. That is all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Lee Artz for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.